Chapter 2. Okay, Midoriya, keep it together. Whatever was going on here, it was definitely not normal. Shigaraki and All Might alive, injuries he couldn't remember receiving, hospital staff ordered to sedate him on sight, rather than try a peaceful return to his room. It all blurred together to form a very disturbing whole. He wasn't sure how long it had been since he'd been knocked out and brought back to his hospital room, but it had to have been a while given how dry his mouth was again. They must have kept refilling the drugs too, because his metabolism, after he'd come into 100% of One for All, would have burned through in hours what would take others days. Then again, he was definitely not at peak form. Disregarding his problems with One for All, he was horribly out of shape. Surely someone would have mentioned if he'd been in a coma, induced or otherwise, long enough to get this skinny. Part of him even felt shorter than he should have been, but that was impossible, right? They hadn't mentioned any sort of need to remove bone from his legs. The breaks had been clean enough. There were fresh bandages on his torso, and a new ache in his left side. The rough landing might have re-ruptured something internal. Jumping out a window with newly healed injuries wasn't the smartest move, but he'd lacked much of an alternative. As far as he could tell, there hadn't been any sort of alarm raised. Why hadn't Shigaraki attacked him while he was unconscious? Getting past all the guards in the hospital just to play video games in a corner until he woke up? Not even an attempt to rouse him? Current hypothesis was leaning more towards hallucination or illusion quirk. They didn't fully explain All Might, though. Brain damage wasn't completely out of the running. After a quick look around the room, he didn't see any of the usual paraphernalia given to people with memory loss or impaired function. No obvious date plastered on the wall. Nothing like who the Prime Minister was, or, heaven forbid, Izuku's own name. Maybe this was the coma? Izuku pinched himself and grimaced as he managed to pull at a new scrape. Probably not unconscious then. Not many options to consider just yet. He wasn't about to head into Matrix-like simulation territory until he'd investigated further. How to go about it, though? He was stuck in a hospital bed, unlikely to be let out for even longer now, after the stunt he'd pulled. Would he see All Might again? What would happen if he had both dead men in his room at the same time? Midoriya Izuku! Izuku froze, mind instantly blank. He was in for it now. Mom, don't you mom me, young man! You almost gave your brother a heart attack! Not to mention all the stress you put your father and me through. He had to watch you be sedated by hospital workers. Mom's hands were white-knuckled fists, shaking hard with suppressed emotions. Dad's back from ripping yourself free from your drip? Jumping out of a window on legs you broke not even 2 weeks ago. Do I even want to know what you were thinking? You'll have some serious apologizing to do next time you see Tenko. If he'll even agree to see you anytime soon after the way he said you looked at him. Tenko is more upset than I've seen him since the Garden Shields incident, Izuku. There were tears in Mom's eyes, though she was holding them back with more fortitude than she usually could. It had been a long while since she'd gotten into him this hard. His father was rarely brought up since their separation, so it spoke to the extent of his injuries that Hisashi had come back to Japan. Of course, Izuku probably would have gone to him if he'd seen him anywhere near where he'd run into All Might. And who the heck was Tenko? This brother he apparently had. Surely he'd remember one of his parents remarrying, or giving birth to another son. The name was oddly familiar, though. Mom flopped into the seat beside his bed, back under the window now, and buried her face in her hands. I don't know what to do with you, Izuku. We thought we'd lost you twice over, and now you're throwing yourself out windows. I never should have let Toshinori talk me into this whole hero thing. Ever since you entered that damn school, it's all I can do to keep it together. Izuku sighed. He thought they'd long since gotten over the whole going to UA thing. Mom had moved on to his work hours at this point. You're going to give me grey hairs, Izuku, I swear. The sooner you come into all of your power, the better. At least then I don't have to rely on other people to protect you.
Goodness knows they're doing a horrible job of it. Impenetrable walls my ass.
But I have. Each piece of the puzzle suddenly arranged itself, and a horrible, extremely insane, probably fiction-inspired idea came into his head.
Mom, do you have a mirror I can use, please?
Mom looked puzzled, but fished around in her bag until she found a small makeup mirror. It wasn't ideal, but it would be enough. There was a moment of denial-fueled hesitation before Izuku took the mirror. Gone were the scars, the slightly crooked nose from that one incident with the tram, the tan from years in the sun on patrols. Instead, he found a round face staring back at him, cheeks still chubby with baby fat, two large eyes staring at him, like a deer caught in headlights. Fuck. It was probably a testament to how bad he looked that she didn't scold him for the language, in English or otherwise. There were painfully dark bags under his eyes, on his painfully pale skin. He couldn't remember the last time his freckles had been so stark. Not to mention they'd shaved his fucking hair. Izuku did not have the head shape to pull off bald. At least he could blame the drugs in his system when tears welled up in those bewildered eyes.
Mom, I think I'm going crazy.
Oh no, honey, no. Mom insisted, but he couldn't help but notice she pressed the nurse call button surreptitiously. Izuku spent the next half hour being subjected to question after question that he didn't know the right answer to. All the things that were correct to him no longer applied, and each time he stayed quiet rather than saying something wrong was another mark against his sanity. He eavesdropped on the nurse and his mother talking about getting in a specialist next day. Great. How old was he anyway in this delusion, dream, nervous breakdown? 15, 16? His growth spurt, much more out than up, had started at 17, so he was certainly younger than that. God, right in the middle of puberty. That had been bad enough the first time. He didn't need another go at it. Calm down, Deku. Whatever was going on, ending up in a literal psychiatric ward was not going to get him back to normal. There was no way this was something he was conjuring with his own mind. There was just too much detail. Izuku shuddered. Stuck in a reinforced, padded room, forced into a straitjacket, and doped up on quirk suppressants. How could he help people? Continue to be a hero? Mom returned and took up his good hand again, more gently than before. Izuku, she said, then paused, pursing her lips, taking a deep breath and blinking back tears. It took her a moment longer before she could continue. Izuku, 4 weeks ago, you were kidnapped. Here. Mom needed another minute or two to compose herself. Izuku just stared at the ceiling, because this definitely hadn't happened to him as a teenager. They had you for 2 weeks. Your father's friend in the police said it looks like you escaped by yourself, so we still don't know who it was that took you. She squeezed his hand. So, no, honey, you're not going crazy, but we can't rule out that whoever had you did something to you. He had to take a few deep breaths of his own to stop his mind from running out of control before he could fish for more information. Where was I taken from? Unless all your classmates are lying to cover something up. And Mom's voice said she wouldn't rule that possibility out. You were taken from UA. Well, at least that explained the comment about UA's defense system, and being chased down and sedated, he supposed. It also meant that he couldn't just come out and say he wasn't there, Izuku. Any hint he was anything but a confused teenager, and they'd have him in a cell rather than an easily escapable hospital room. So he would need to lie convincingly enough that they thought he had recall problems, but not a whole decade and a bit of extra memories. What had happened to the person that was supposed to be in this body right now? Were they in his? Oh God, what if he'd died, and his consciousness had usurped his younger self entirely? Better stick with the body swap idea for now, for his own sanity. All right, Deku. Time for operation. Establish yourself as this Izuku, and research until you find a way home. The plan was easy enough to formulate. After his mother went home for the day, Izuku waited until his next checkup by a nurse. More medication, more questions. At least he was able to repeat the answers they'd given him earlier. It was a different nurse from before. Night shift, most likely, given how dark it was outside, and the man was wearing a thin uniform coat against the cold. The lump of his phone and notepad showing through hip pockets. The nurse leaned in, his eyes spinning and contracting oddly as he administered the painkillers. When he was almost done, Izuku tried to sit up and hissed in pain. The nurse was quick to push him back down, getting in closer to have enough leverage to do it without hurting him. One mild scolding later and the nurse left. Izuku smiled his best innocent little boy smile, tucking the stolen phone under the sheets. Considering the make and model of the phone, he tapped the corner to wake it up, then tilted the screen so that the residual fingerprints reflected. One jagged line stood out. Izuku couldn't quite contain a wry smile as he swiped up, with his knuckle rather than his fingertip, and found a pattern-based password. One try and the device opened to him. How had they ever considered this sort of thing secure? Time to get to work, he supposed. No telling how long he'd have before the nurse discovered it missing. Basic things like the date and current political climate were easy enough. A quick bit of math, and Izuku discovered he was 16. His second term at UA had begun just over 6 weeks ago. Internet searches for anything related to All Might, Izuku himself, and UA revealed some information, but not much. No huge breaches in security like the USJ attack. No kidnapping at summer training camp. No All Might's last stand. Thanking whatever gods were listening that he hadn't paid attention to Tenya's lectures about password strength, meaning he'd had the same password since middle school, he logged into his Line account. What met him was a deluge of worried messages from nearly his entire high school class. A quick search found his last response to any of them 4 weeks ago, when he'd apparently been kidnapped. Izuku allowed himself a small moment to freak out again. Almost a month of lost time. Taking a deep breath, he started to scroll back, looking for keywords to save on time. It was rare he needed to investigate something covertly, but it did happen. Toru had gone underground after they graduated, and had lots of useful tips for just this sort of situation. After a quick search for All Might specifically, and finding not much more than he was still nominally active, Izuku figured he'd pushed his luck far enough. Erasing his activity as best he could, he gently dropped the phone to the ground to be discovered. Hopefully the nurse didn't get suspicious, because he didn't know if his efforts would hold up to any sort of scrutiny. Riley, Izuku figured if he got caught, he could always turn on the waterworks and say he missed his friends. It wouldn't even be a lie. Would they let him go back to UA? That was a bittersweet idea. A normal high school experience. A chance to help his friends earlier, if they even needed it. Was 1A still made up of the same students? Izuku's thoughts spiraled as he considered just how different this reality could potentially be if he really had changed dimensions as well as going back in time.
Sorry to bother you again, Midoriya-kun.
The nurse was back. Izuku checked the time and found he'd allowed himself 5 minutes grace. Much better to be safe than sorry. It was still a little sad he couldn't tell the man how easily his phone could be accessed. Hopefully it never got stolen. Left alone again, the drugs in his system were starting to pull him down. Izuku sighed loudly and resigned himself to yet another adventure. He'd been due something big for a while now, after all. Just his luck that it would be the most confusing one yet.